Uh, Today, in reflecting on what I was going to say tonight, I kind of drifted back. We've been meeting for 24 years. Some of you remember. I was thinking of a lot of the people that have come and gone. And there's been a lot of water over the dam. Personally reflecting on our lives and globally, the flow of history. When I think back of, we were meeting in 1999 and we mourned together the Columbine massacre, which seemed to launch this continuing wave that's now too familiar, mass murder. There was 9/11, in which our country's response and invasion of Iraq destabilized the entire Middle East. And we've been at war there for 18 years. The collateral damage resulting from what we began has now exceeded 1 million deaths and 70 million refugees forced for one reason or another to move. And over that time, over these 24 years, we've borne witness to all the natural disasters, and possibly linked to climate change, hurricanes, floods, fires, all increasing in frequency and intensity. And of course, there's COVID-19. It's taken over our lives. But tonight, I want to devote our time together to attending to what's happening in our cities and explore a little bit about why, and explore a little bit about where the practice lands with all of this. There is, of course, cause and effect. That's a hallmark of our practice, kind of examining causes and effects. And over the last week, you all have felt deeply the tear in the social fabric of our nation. It's heartbreaking. It's disturbing. It's really not new. It was predictable. So we sit here now, it's June 2nd, with a backdrop of over 105,000 people who have died from the COVID infection, more than twice the losses that we suffered in Vietnam. And could a more appropriate government response have kept those numbers smaller, reduced the terrible suffering that all those families are enduring? And also part of the backdrop where we meet tonight is that over 40 million people are unemployed. The economy is in ruins. And some recent research shows that between 40 and 50% of American adults are only $400 away from going broke. One medical expense, a brake job on the car, and they're over the edge. So tonight, there's fear, there's dread, there's uncertainty. And it's literally fraying the mental health of great swaths of our neighbors. And now, added on to that backdrop, yet again, more police malfeasance and the killings of African Americans. Ahmaud Arbery hunted down by gunmen in a truck. George Floyd pinned to the ground by an armed agent of the state, dying slowly and publicly. Breonna Taylor gunned down in her home. And now the protests and the riots. The legacy that we're living is not the manifest destiny we all learned about in grammar school. That legacy did build tremendous wealth and power for this country, and especially for select groups in this country. That legacy, that manifest destiny, first began with the remorseless genocide of Native peoples, followed closely by the shameful cultivation of the enslavement of other humans. How could anyone think that? And it was supported by all quarters of society. The financial institutions in the United States and Europe that offered stock options to the public on slave trading companies and offered loans and liquidity to the slavers. The shipbuilding establishment in the Northeast of the United States that supplied all the slave ships, and all the other associated businesses and support, down to those who made the shackles, whips, and various other medieval devices of torture, all designed to create maximum pain and terror in the enslaved person. It's like all the chickens are coming home to roost. And the civil unrest of protests and rioting are following on the heels of all of this. It's cause and effect. So where do the Buddha's teachings land in this? You know, I first think of, oh my gosh, the three poisons, as the Buddha called them. They still have such great purchase in the hearts and minds of humanity. Right there, sitting alongside the better angels of our nature. It's all there within us. So the three poisons, the unbridled greed being the first poison, the concentration of more and more resources in the hands of a few, never being satisfied, never enough. And then there's all the forms of aversion, especially fear and hatred of the perceived other. The perceived other. And then there's delusion. The wholesale delusion that ignores racial and other forms of injustice, that ignores the craziness of an economic model that demands greater and greater growth and depletion of resources at the expense of fouling the nest, the accelerating environmental degradation. Now, as students of the Buddha, we're implored to pay specific attention to harm. Are your thoughts, words, actions leading to harm or harmony to yourself or others? It's just that simple, that question, harm or harmony. And just like the teachings implore you to continually reflect on your personal actions and integrity as part of your overall development, your growth curve of wisdom and compassion, it makes a lot of sense that a continued examination of our cultural institutions is in order, just as we reflect on ourselves. Internally, reflect externally. In fact, it's in the Satipatthana Sutta, said in a number of ways. So what aspects of a particular institution is causing harm, and what aspects support harmony? Sure, it can be really complex. And we can differ in our opinions and our approach and our political perspective. But if our North Star is always to reduce harm and support harmony. That's our practice. That's any contemplative practice that has any worth to it. And we've talked about it a bunch here, but foundational to contemplative practice is bridging all separations. It's an illusion that we're separate. It's a complete illusion. Everything is interconnected, interdependent. You wouldn't be here. Zoom wouldn't be here. You know. So bridging this illusion of separation, whether you feel it in relation to someone's race that happens to be different than yours, or relation to someone's class, or their ethnicity, or their sexual orientation, their political party, their disability, or a felt separation from the environment. They're all in this basket of separations. In Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail, he said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." And he went on to say, "We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." Bridging separation in all its forms is where the rubber meets the road of a spiritual practice. Here at the Insight Meditation Community of Charlottesville, we have numerous small groups grappling with this, learning together. They're now called racial affinity groups. Each group, by design, has a small number of participants so that we can keep them intimate. And in these groups, we explore these felt separations and conditionings, specifically concerning race. We look at our white privilege and we study the historical and present institutional racism. And these racial affinity groups, although focusing on race specifically, are a template for bridging all separations. It's a deep dive into that feeling of kind of disconnect, which can hold fear, contraction, a whole constellation of reactivity. But by applying attention and our intention in the form of the mindfulness practice, by turning toward that experience of felt separation, noticing any contractions or recoil in the body when it occurs in a particular situation where we know we're feeling separate or disconnected. Noticing over and over what emotions, what thoughts are rolling through. And then bringing forward some measure of courage to stay with this uncomfortableness and explore what is possible if we stay in this kind of zone of vulnerability. We've all been conditioned in various ways, but that's not the final story. There's a lot that's possible through the application of this simple mindfulness practice. And what is possible? We can vastly increase our capacity for empathy and for compassion and for authentic connection. Having a strong contemplative practice has never been more important. And cultivating clear seeing with the strength and power of empathy, compassion, and equanimity It's the way forward for our species. It's our chance. It may actually be the only way. We certainly know a lot intellectually. We have a lot of great science. We have tremendous resources and the capacity to support a dignified and sustainable life for everyone on this planet. It's a consciousness problem. It always has been. The powers of greed, hatred, and delusion need our attention, need the attention of our institutions and leaders. And bridging all these separations is a lifetime of work. And maybe more than a lifetime if you believe in reincarnation and that. Once again, Martin Luther King, we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I want to read a piece to you that appeared in The Guardian. Maybe some of you have seen it, written by William Barber, Reverend William Barber. It was in, I think, this weekend. Now, some background on William Barber, who was here during the Troubles in Charlottesville. He came and spoke and offered support. He's co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign. It's a national call for a moral revival. And the Poor People's Campaign, a little background on that, was originally initiated by Martin Luther King back in 1966. I mean, by 1966, he'd had some success in the civil rights movement, but he envisioned spending the rest of his life devoted to an expanded movement of all poor and working class people, bringing together marginalized poor whites, Native people, all economically depressed minorities, coming together with the existing labor unions to push for compassionate social reforms, including healthcare, education, economic fairness. Dr. King often used the example of the United Auto Workers and other powerful unions. He was a great advocate for unions, where he saw it manifest. People of different races, ethnicities, religions, backgrounds, they came together in struggle to create a more dignified existence for their people. But he also had concerns. He saw a limited American future and potential if there existed only fragmented groups working for similar change. He felt that these groups could become so self-absorbed and limited in power that not much would get accomplished. That's why he began his movement. Sadly, he was killed in 1968 before this movement could get legs. But that was his vision, and I think it was his greatest vision. So this mantle has been picked up by the Reverend William Barber. And he said this in The Guardian, and I'll read it to you. No one wants to see their community burn, but the fires burning in Minneapolis, just like the fire burning in the spirits of so many marginalized Americans today, are a natural response to the trauma Black communities have experienced generation after generation. No one wants the fires. Even activists on the ground have said this, but they have also shared how their nonviolent pleas and protests have gone unnoticed for years as the situation has gotten out of hand. No one knows who and what is behind the violence, but we do know that countless activists, grassroots leaders, and preachers were screaming nonviolently long before now. Change America. Change Minneapolis. Rather than listen, many of those in power saw even their nonviolent protest as an unwelcome development. This is so often the case because many Americans struggle to imagine that our government's policies and its long train of abuses demand a radical transformation. Too many want to believe racism is merely caused by a few bad actors. We often turn racism into a spectacle, only considering the cruel legacy of racism when an egregious action escalates outrage to this level. Black Americans have rarely been able to sustain such illusions. Deadly racism is always with us, and not only through police brutality. In the midst of the current pandemic, we are painfully aware that our families bear a disproportionate burden of the COVID-19 deaths. In some cities where racial data is available, we know that Black people are 6 times as likely to die from the virus as their white counterparts. Even before COVID, large numbers of Black Americans died because of the racial disparities in healthcare, which are systemic and not unintentional. African Americans are 3 times more likely to die from particulate air pollution than our fellow Americans. The percentage of Black children suffering from asthma is nearly double that of white people, and the death rate is 10 times higher. This is but a reflection of the fissures of inequality that run through every institution in our public life, where the Black wealth gap, education gap, and healthcare gap have persisted despite the civil rights movement, legal desegregation, and symbolic affirmative action. We understand that the same mentality that will accept and defend the violence of armed officers against unarmed Black people will also send Black, brown, and poor people into harm's way during a pandemic in the name of liberty and the economy. Many have cited Dr. King to remind Americans that a riot is the language of the unheard. A riot is the language of the unheard. But I've been reflecting on the eulogy he offered when another man, a white man who came to Selma, Alabama to work for voting rights, was brutally murdered by racist violence in 1965. At the funeral for James Reed, Dr. King said, "It is not enough to ask who killed the victim in a case like the murder of George Floyd." Weak and unacceptable charges have been brought against the officer whose knee choked George Floyd, staying on his neck for 3 minutes after he went unconscious. But no charges have been filed against the other officers who stood by and watched. Even still, dealing with who did the killing is not all that justice demands. Dr. King said that the question is not only who killed him, but also what killed him. Those of us who have faced the lethal force of systemic racism have also learned something else in the American story. We can be wounded healers. The systemic racism that killed George Floyd has taken untold souls from us for over 400 years, and it is killing the very possibility of American democracy today. I join those screaming that this is all screwed up, and it's been screwed up for far too long. But we are not screwed up as long as we have the consciousness and the humanity to know what is right and wrong. We don't have to be arbitrarily destructive. We can be determined to never accept the destruction of our bodies and dreams by any police, person, or policy. We have learned that there is a force more powerful. When hands that once picked cotton have joined together with white hands and Native hands, brown hands, and Asian hands, we have been able to fundamentally reconstruct this democracy. Slavery was abolished. Women did gain the right to vote. Labor did win a 40-hour work week and a minimum wage. The civil rights movement, in the face of lynching and shooting, did expand voting rights to African Americans. If we take time to listen to this nation's wounds, they tell us where to look for hope. The hope is in the mourning and in the screams, which make us want to rush from this place. There is a sense in which right now we must refuse to be comforted too quickly. Only if these screams and tears and protests shake the very conscience of this nation, and until there is real political and judicial repentance, can we hope for a better society on the other side of this. Reverend William Barber. I want to read one much shorter piece to you. And this is from the teachers from the Insight Meditation Society in Barre, Massachusetts. And many of the teachers here at IMCC feel a connection to IMS, and some of us feel a really strong sense that it's kind of our spiritual home or birthplace. Personally, I served on the board there for 7 years and taught there many times, and they really strive to offer a quality instruction and a quality experience to those who come there to learn contemplative practices. So the teachers have said this: the murder of George Floyd strikes the hearts and minds of so many with feelings of outrage, sadness, and grief. All the more that it was undeniably so overt, as if such actions were somehow acceptable. It is only because of the courage of the young woman who recorded it all that the truth of the matter is unavoidably and forever there in front of our eyes, removing any illusion that the killing was somehow defensible or due to any action on the part of Mr. Floyd. Perhaps more devastating and telling is that this continuing and blatant disregard for our common humanity no longer astonishes us. This incident, like that of Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, and too many others, brings into sharp relief the tragic reality of racism and the historical legacy of enslavement of Africans and others in our country. It highlights the Buddha's teachings about the mind's capacity to experience both the highest good and also the greatest evil. All actions have their genesis in our hearts and minds. The light of awareness is in this moment shining brightly upon the tragic manifestations of hatred, ignorance, and delusion that led to the death of George Floyd. Delusion blames others, creates enemies, and fosters disconnection, sustaining the illusion of separateness upon which war, racism, and injustice rest. True lasting change will only come when we awaken that sense of personal and shared responsibility and compassion for all. For white people in our sanghas, there is a responsibility to educate ourselves about the historic and current expressions of racism and oppression so that we can be a positive force for the good. We are called upon to see and come close to the magnitude of the suffering before us and not turn away once again as if these devastating events are singular occurrences. It is not enough to practice loving kindness and compassion in the solitude of our meditation. We can all strive to have them manifest in our actions actively seeking ways to address the immediacy of the suffering as well as its many underlying causes. The same qualities that the Buddha taught as the basis for awakening can be applied to our service in the world. It is time to bring consistently and persistently mindful awareness, keen discernment, energetic response, intense interest, a foundation of calm and steadiness, and a spaciousness that can hold it all. In telling the truth and helping others in whatever way we can, we are cultivating all these qualities in ourselves. And by cultivating them in ourselves, we develop the inner resources and resilience to effectively be of help to others. This is the charge we must all answer and work. Each of us must engage and do. All of us at IMS continue to be committed to the Dharma of justice, equity, inclusion, and freedom. May all beings, with no exceptions, be safe and free from danger and harm. May all be at peace. So I want to offer a reflection to end the evening. And in service of the mutuality and connection of all living beings that are taught by the Buddha, Martin Luther King, Gandhi, others, just reflect for a moment. What is within my capacity to reduce harm as I understand it? Recognizing it's an ongoing practice, even understanding what leads to harm and what leads to harmony. What is within my capability to do to reduce harm as I understand it? And what is also within my capability to do to promote harmony? Will I exercise this capacity? Do I have the strength and the willingness? How will I do it and why? And when? Well, thank you all. And as human beings, we have such fabulous potential capacity to do good, to support one another. You know, these practices support those better angels of ourselves. And although things are almost as dark as they can get now, it ain't over till it's over, as Yogi Berra said. And there's a lot of bright lights. There's a lot of good hearts working in all corners of our country and the world. And we've made extraordinary accomplishments if you look over the history of humankind. And there's a lot of cooperation, there's a lot of kindness, you know, that's marveled into it all. And so that's also our great strength. So everything changes again, changes again. So wishing you the best, and we'll convene again next week. Stay well. Thank you for your attention.